Hey everybody. So, chapter 10, commercial quickening and religious reform. Yeah, so this chapter we're going to look at things to do with religion in Europe, cities and towns, how sort of how community is organized. We're going to talk about trade guilds, craft guilds, which are really significant in Europe. It really becomes a big part of European culture and European society. We'll also look at the Crusades, which is always interesting. The Crusades, a little bit about England, and that's it. This may be maybe a shorter chapter. Maybe. We'll see. All right. Dives and Lazarus. So this is a biblical parable. Again, it's a story about from the Bible, a biblical story, and it has to do with, well, it has to do with money. It has to do with because much of this chapter really focuses on wealth and the economy in Europe in this time period. So Dives is in the top right corner. See him up there at the top. He's rich. He's feasting. He's enjoying his life and all of his status and wealth. While towards the bottom we see Lazarus dying, and actually we see Lazarus lies dying, and eventually Lazarus is actually accepted into the arms of Abraham with an angel over his body. So we have Dives here feasting. We have Lazarus on the ground. Lazarus being accepted into the arms of Abraham with an angel looking over his shoulder. Okay. Below that, we can actually see, I know it's tough to make it out, but trust me, you can see Dives here actually descending into hell with angels surrounding him. Due to his gluttony, uh, he is now going to hell. So the poor man, the common man who asks for forgiveness, receives salvation. The rich man who only seems to care about himself, he's condemned to hell. This is probably carved by monks in Toulouse. It's in France. It's really indicative of how much wealth was being generated in Paris around this time, the Ile de Paris, which we have already mentioned. That whole little area of Paris where the king was and all the power was. The Paris Island, which was not an actual island, it was just this area around Paris. So it's an indication of the wealth and status and the warnings about it. The warnings from the Christian church about how wealth and status could pollute the soul or even condemn the soul to hell. Um, yeah, there's a big concern about the amount of wealth generation in this time period. We see lots and lots of rich people, and the concern is people are actually pulling away from the church, more concerned with material matters than religious matters. So start with fairs, towns, and cities. So this commercial revolution seems to overtake Europe in this time period. We see a great deal of wealth and power generated. It often takes place in three different venues: the markets, the fairs, and the permanent town centers. Markets, fairs are very temporal. They come and go, often in very rural areas. Although don't get me wrong, most of Europe is rural in this time period. Um, the markets are also a little movable. The markets, typically towns will have a market center, but the the stalls in the market, I guess is the best way to put it, the customers in the market are different. It'd be like going to a store like Walmart or something, and every time you went, there would be different goods available. Sometimes they have something here, and sometimes they don't, and you never know whether they're going to have those goods. That's the way a market is. It's very fluid. Well, the actual commercial town centers were generally permanent shops, permanent stores. So you have three different types of economic centers here. One more rural, the other two sort of urban, but one is very fluid and one is very stable. Regardless, though, they're all over the place. We have markets and goods and trade all over the place, which was different. You think like in modern times, that's the way life is. Well, back then, most people made and purchased goods and traded for goods all in their local little community. So the idea of going to a market to buy and trade goods with people from miles away or cities away or even other countries was really unusual. It was a novel thing. It really was. So this was a little different. Local inhabitants often did not have to pay taxes or tolls, but merchants from the outside, they often were charged fees as well as entry and exit fees. Because there was so much wealth generation, these cities, these commercials, markets, and fairs had to make profit. Everybody's making profit. So whether it's the merchants making profit, the ones owning the land making a profit, the ones owning the brothels or the motels or the restaurants, everybody's got to make money. And so that's just another aspect of this new economy that everybody's getting a piece of it and everybody expects to profit off of it. It isn't so much about helping out your neighbor anymore as enriching yourself. Certainly changes. Many of these permanent commercial centers that we see, like in cities and towns, they often develop around castles, around monasteries, and of course, which is still the way it is. The most of the major town centers that exist in Europe in this time period had been ancient Roman towns. Rome founded, and by this time period, which we're talking about hundreds of years, 500 or more years after Rome, still, most of the major urban centers were actually founded and built by Rome. So the influence of Roman architecture and Roman decisions to build a town here at this particular spot, wherever it is, are still felt half a millennia after Rome has fallen. Often the great lords in the countrysides, which could include monasteries, which were in some cases a monastery was the center of the entire community out in the rural areas. These lords, the monasteries, they often organize their land, they reorganize their land in addition for productivity. They would encourage peasants to farm new products as they would be introduced from other countries and other places. And they also converted, if you remember before we said, pretty much all the peasants and the poor paid their taxes and paid their fees, whatever their fees were or whatever the bills were, either in food or service or labor. That starts to change. By the 11th century, it becomes much more common for people to pay in actual money. But that's because of the markets. Because anyone, even poor farmers, can get a couple bushels of whatever food they're growing and transport it to market and actually get money, actually get real coinage. So we are transitioning, I guess the better word, to an actual market currency economy, as opposed to the old economy, which was much more based on trade and barter and exchange of services. I'll give you this and you do labor for me, for instance. Now it's really becoming a lot more about a money economy. It really is. Most long distance cross cultural merchants were either Jewish people, typically, or Italians. Jewish and Italians are the ones that are more likely to be bankers, long distance merchants, have connections in multiple countries and multiple territories. Many Jewish people who've been driven off their lands in Europe, Jewish people were persecuted in this time period, as many religious groups were. If you were not a Catholic, Christian, and there were lots of other types of religious denominations in Europe, you would often be persecuted by the Christian church. Not necessarily executed, although that did occasionally happen, but you would be pushed off your lands, you might lose your businesses, you would be taxed extra. Um, yeah, it was tough. If you were not directly aligned with the Catholic Church in Europe, you were often an outsider. Jewish people fit in this category. Um, uh, we see many Jewish people actually convert to commerce full time. This has two effects. One, that means many of your merchants and business people and bankers are Jewish. And second, many Jewish people move to the cities because that's what has the flourishing economies. The cities have a much bigger economy. So if you are a merchant, you want to have connections or even live and work in the city. These Jewish people lived in the cities. They were considered a protected class, but they also were exploited. Sometimes they had to pay extra fees, extra taxes. And the justification for this was twofold. One, they're Jewish, so they're outsiders, they're not Christians. And second, because they were often dealing with banking and money and commerce and trade, the impression was they had more money. The impression was they were rich, wealthy. So they justified charging them extra fees. Even though, as I said a moment ago, foreign merchants often got charged extra fees and charges, entrance and exit fees for their goods. Jewish people that lived in the cities got charged the same fees for the reasons I just explained. Most towns grew very haphazard. There was almost no official planning of towns. They would just add on sections, build homes, build shops, build businesses in whatever direction it fit. The cities also were growing dramatically. In a 100-year period from the 11th to the 12th century, we see the population of cities in Europe double. So the cities can't quite keep up with it. So many people are coming into the cities for all these new economic opportunities. Um, they build things as quickly as they can to try and give housing or have shops and businesses and streets and stuff like this. So it's really poor construction, often what we call tenements, which is very poor apartments for common people. Very limited services, no like no running water or anything like that. Very cramped spaces, pretty messy, pretty crowded, pretty ugly places. Uh, little bitty efficiency apartments you might think of with no services. It was literally just a room, which might house an entire family. It was pretty bad. Lots of specialized structures. Most of these medieval cities included the marketplace, as I mentioned. They usually would have a castle, and churches were the most common structure. Any large city would literally have a large city like Paris, for instance, something like Paris or London, Rome, dozens of churches. And while they're all primarily Catholic, you will every once in a while find other churches, like Jewish temples and things like this. You do occasionally find other things, but every community was outside of the major city. Pretty much every community was often structured around either a castle or a church, or church slash monastery. So almost every community was focused around a church or a castle a church monastery or a castle. That was often typical, and then everything else would just build up around it. Let's see what else we have. These tenements. I want to mention something else about the tenements. They were often built as like second or third floor. The first floor is where the shops would be, the permanent shops or stalls, and then the second or third floor is where everybody would live. Above that, um, very narrow, very cramped spaces. Often connected with wood frames, they would actually build it. They would build many of these new structures in the cities as they would expand the towns. They would build them with cheap wood construction and cover them with like mud and twigs and sticks, just to give it some rigidity to it. But all this stuff burned really easy too. That was another problem. If fires ever got started in these towns, which were built poorly already, the fires would just rage through the towns. There's lots of incidents where fires would just rage through communities, killing hundreds of people. It was a common thing to do. People would actually keep livestock still inside the city. They would actually keep maybe livestock in their homes if they had a backyard. Even though they might be up on the second floor, there might be a communal yard in the back of the tenement building, where some people might have chickens, a couple people have pigs, a cow or two, and so yeah, your backyard would be a little farm grazing or farmland for animals. Because you must understand, most of these people had literally just transitioned from rural life. So they were farmers and lived in the rural communities, and now live in the cities. So they bring their ideas and traditions with them. Even though you're moving into a city, if you always raise pigs, hell, you bring your pigs with you, if possible. It's interesting. And this really perpetuates the idea of, in rural communities, you provided for yourself, as I was indicating. You provided for yourself, or you traded services or goods with your neighbors. This sort of perpetuates that. You go into the city, well, you're not going to go buy meat from someone else. You bring your own meat with you. You're not going to go buy milk from someone else. You bring your own cow with you. There you go. People sometimes try to grow crops, and ultimately what it results in is like gardens. But they would try to grow crops and gardens, and some neighborhoods would have community gardens right in the middle of the town. They have a little community farm, like right in the middle of the city. It's an unusual blending of rural and urban life, but that's because the cities are now populated with throughout all of Europe. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that had been farmers yesterday, and now they live in the city. And that transition takes a long time to where they become, quote unquote, city people. Takes a while to do that. We see other buildings that are focused on trade, government, charity. It was also very common for these cities as they grew to start building walls. And what's interesting is some of the larger cities have multiple levels of walls because they would build a wall, and then 50 years later they have to build a whole new wall because the city had grown outside the walls, and then they have to build a new wall because warfare was common in Europe among different kings and different lords. For instance, at one point in another 200 or 300 years, there's like 300 different princes and lords just in the German region. 300. And they were constantly vying for control. Warfare was not uncommon. So you had to build up the walls. You had to do that kind of stuff. Very narrow city streets. Yeah, bridges and roads all over the land. Uh, transportation becomes key because we now have so much goods transport, so much goods and property and trade goods. You have to have reliable trade routes. And reliable trade routes, the roads, they start building up the roads. They put stone on the roads to try and make them more permanent and or resistant to the weather, like rain. It's just a dirt road. When it rains during the winter, it just becomes mud. It's almost impassable. So they put the rocks and the bricks and stone on the roads to make them sort of permanent or acceptable in the winter. But another very prosperous way of trade, and prosperous because it was quick, it was fast, it was efficient, and it was always there, whether it was rain, summer, or winter, was the water. If you could afford ships, which were much more expensive than simply a horse and wagon, but if you were a more of an upper class merchant and you actually had a business and partners, and you could afford ships, that was the way to go. Because with ships, you could carry a lot more goods, a lot farther. And generally speaking, the farther you could transport goods, the more money you got for it. Because if it was worth it to transport it long distance, people would pay more for it. So long distance transport over rivers and oceans and seas, the Baltic Sea, Mediterranean Sea, the Rhine, the Po, the Rhone, those are all rivers. If you could transport along those, you were more of a well off merchant, plus you had more resources available, and you potentially could make a lot more money. And those are always there. It doesn't matter if it's rain or not, there's rivers are always there, they don't dry up. So that was another real access. So we have now overland access, we have river access, we have sea and ocean access. They're starting to ship goods to the Mediterranean Sea out into the Atlantic Ocean. Another thing, which is another aspect of this, which isn't really talked about, is new technologies. They have to have new technologies to build these ships, especially the bigger ships to carry cargo, to navigate. We will talk about that later. The commercial revolution. It really changes. I mean, today we couldn't even look back. I mean, today everything is commercialized. Literally everything we have, we purchase from someone else. I mean, how many of you make your own clothes, make your own food? I mean, let's face it. Just about every single thing we wear, do, eat, watch, entertainment, I mean, everything about our lives is purchased from someone else or some company or a service. It didn't used to be like this. 1,000 years ago, most of the stuff we did or made ourselves. And then the commercial revolution hits, and suddenly everything becomes specialized. Someone now lives their whole life just making clothes or making shoes or producing tombstones, for instance. That's your job. Jewish cemetery at Worms is also in France. We can see evidence of large Jewish community in Central Europe. Lots of Jewish people in the central France, which of course was the Ile de Paris, that economic center of France. This is likely the largest one outside of Eastern Europe, outside of the Middle East, probably the largest, most well-known Jewish cemetery outside of the Middle East. Probably dates to around 1,000 years ago. It's quite impressive. It's still standing there. Of course, it's an important site. Can you imagine some of these stones have stood for 1,000 years? Impressive, very solemn. This is an image of a tannery district in France. Now, this is a photograph, so this is a lot more modern. It's probably from the 1800s. But we think this is probably very indicative of what it looked like back then. The people lived up above, the businesses were on the bottom. They had the canal going right through because this is Metz, this is in France. Most of this, again, economic center, a lot of this is really has to do with the Ile-de-France, which doesn't have anything with water. Even though there's a canal, that has nothing with water. It's just this little island of economic prosperity and political power in the center of France. So it's all right there together. They live above, they work below, and then the ships and barges and boats will come through and pick up their goods. A tannery, that's like making like leather goods into clothes. Um, this also says some other things about the pollution in the city. It's probably likely they would have simply because to tan leather requires lots of chemicals. They would have probably just poured the excess waste chemicals right into the river, just dumped it right out into the water. And then somewhere down the line, people would drink that water. There was no water system, no official water system, sewer systems in most of these cities. Um, it shows what the life was like because you imagine living and working above this place that has all these poisonous chemicals all the time. So your whole life, you're working with the chemicals, you're breathing the chemicals, you live in the community where those chemicals are. Probably a lot of these chemicals are carcinogens, you're cancer causing. We do know life expectancy in the city was lower than the country. Average life expectancy in the city was years less. Why did so many people go? Well, number one, they didn't really have a real concept of life expectancy back then. You know what I mean? You walk around town, you'd see some 70-year-old person somewhere. So as far as most people are concerned, you could live to be old. Yet we do know from records and lots of evidence that life expectancy in like these cities, these industrial cities, like Metz here, for instance, or like London or Paris, people might live on average just 10 years less, 5 years less as a result of the dangers of the cities, the pollution, the chemicals, the fact that they're drinking polluted water all the time. Child mortality rates were much higher. It's interesting. It really says a lot about this, about what life was like. Even though it's some more of a modern picture, it probably looked very similar to this, which also says something else about Europe. Europe's economic, it stays very stable over the years. The difference in life living in a city in 1300 and 1700 in Europe, not much different. It didn't really change. But living on the farm didn't really change either. So the life of a common laborer, worker, peasant in European society didn't really change much from this period once the changes occur here for really until the full-on industrial revolution, which hits in the 1800s. 1600s in England, but everywhere else in Europe it's the 17, 1800s. Um, so for better part of 500 years, life is pretty static for most people. Very interesting. We have an image here. Image of the city of Piacenza. Mm, I don't have it, but I'm willing to bet that's probably Italy. I don't want to say in my notes, but it's probably Italy. Economic industries moving into the city. Historically speaking, we never really looked back. Our cities are all hubs of economic consumerism today, and that's where it really begins. Uh, we do not have what we would call factories yet. We don't have actually factories, but they're not far off. We have even before the Industrial Revolution, we started having things like factories, and really, what is a factory ultimately? It's just a group of people working under the same roof, doing all parts of making a product. That's really all it is. It's multiple people under the same roof working together with a division of labor, each one's doing their own part to produce some type of product. Literally, it could be a shirt or canned meat in a slaughterhouse, whatever the product is. That's really all a factory is. We might think factory today is industrialization, mechanization, computers, robots, assembly lines, all that kind of stuff. That's the modern factory. But a factory is just really as simple as what I just said. It didn't have to have any type of machines of any sort. It can simply be hand power. Um, what do we have going on here? Yeah, so this is to Genoa. So this is obviously Italy. Yeah, the smiths in this territory, the leather workers over here, the fish workers down by the water, by the canals. Very interesting. Churches or monasteries. How many are there? Look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I just counted 22. This isn't big. These are city streets. This isn't a big territory. This isn't that big of an area. Yeah, I mean these are probably the major city streets, but I'm just saying 22 churches or monasteries. Yeah, very often these towns are simply formed um, from what had been local farming communities, and they just get bigger and bigger, and they start building. And look at the walls, as I mentioned before. The late wall from antiquity, an antique wall, antiquity meaning the time of like the Romans. So you just go say the 400s. So this was probably the wall in the 400s of this community. By the 800s, the dash line. By 1169 is the solid black line. And 100 years later, it's the red line. They keep having to add the walls and keep expanding the walls as the city grows. Another effect of all these walls is it also excuse me, it also socioeconomically stratifies the city. You often will find as they add more and more walls, you have different quarters of the city to where people live. So you'll find between this wall, this is where the Jewish people live. This wall and this wall over here is where all the merchants live, for instance. So between different walls, and because they'll have gates in the walls, they'll actually start to become sort of delineated. That this is the foreign quarter, this is the poor quarter, this is the merchant quarter. They'll even get really specialized. Like here's the jewelry and money quarter, for instance, or this is the smithing artisan quarter where they make all the metal and leather and stuff like that. So you'll see they'll actually get very specialized. Very interesting how the modern, and why is this significant? Because this is how the modern city develops. The modern city that we all live in, this is really where it begins. The idea of what an actual city is really begins in this time period. Um, Very interesting. Now, Rome had this, but after the fall of Rome, we don't see this again for 500 years. Rome had all this. It had all this already, but then Rome fell, and Europe pretty much stopped doing this for half a millennia. Then they start doing it again, and they don't ever look back from here. Europe doesn't fall again, so from here on out is what cities look like, sort of the organization. Here's another sculpture. This is a sculpture from the passage from the Bible, where people are dressed in modern clothing. Another one of these things where they're sort of revisionist history. So it's a passage from the Bible where people are dressed in normal modern clothes. I mean, here we have a soldier here with a camel, I think is what it's called, which is the helmet. He's wearing chainmail. He's got a sword here. That would be a short sword. He's carrying with him. So yeah, people dressed in modern attire here. He's got a shield on his back. Um, we have a tax collector and a soldier talking to Jesus. So, tax collector and a soldier talking to Jesus. This shows the ties really in European society between religion, the economy, the church, taxes, and the general concern that everybody had about all three. Everybody really concerned themselves with taxes, the economy, and church, religion. Previously, you go back a couple hundred years, the only real thing in Europe that truly united Europe was religion. That was it. You go back to the 800s, and the only thing that really unites Europe is Christianity. That is about the only uniform thing you see across Europe, and it isn't everywhere even then, but very commonly. By 11, 1200s, we now have a lot more things uniting Europe. We now have cities. We have an entire trade economy going across all of Europe. It is an economic revolution. And of course, we have the beginnings of taxation. Remember before, you didn't pay taxes exactly. You simply had to do labor or provide food to your lord on your estate or on your manor lands. Now you have to actually take your food and products and services, go into a town and exchange those for money. And then you have to take that money and pay your lord, pay your rent, pay for your bills. A modern society. Really, we see the beginnings here of modern urban society, to where you don't just trade goods, you have to actually have cash. And you trade cash for what you need services, food, etc. It really changes the way Europe is, and it really becomes the way of the future, becomes the way it is. So, continuing on, there's no mechanization, there's no industrialization exactly yet. But we still have factories, and we have the beginnings of modern economic business, which we'll start with what we'll call guilds. This is really how the society was organized economically. Urban guilds were originally religious in nature, usually started by the church. They were charitable associations of in the same in essence, they were organizations in the same trade. So they'd be like a guild for all iron workers, for instance, would all work in the same guild. And they were charitable organizations to where the workers would actually work and help each other and cooperate. If you don't have enough of this, I'll give you this. If you could, you ran out of supplies, I could help you with that. Or if you didn't sell enough goods and you're starving, the charitable organization will take care of you, provide for your family. If you die, for instance, then they might take care of your family or help you out with food or something like that. That's where it really began. By the 12th century, though, they really become professional corporations, really defined by statutes and rules. You had to pay dues, you had to pay rents, you had to pay fees. They would establish working hours, production standards. It really becomes a more of a modern organization that really oversees an entire industry. Same thing though, it still follows a trade. So you're going to have a metal worker guild, you're going to have a jewelry guild, you're going to have a pottery guild, you might have a winemakers guild. So there's still going to be these trade groups that specifically oversee a particular part of the economy or a particular sector of industry, for instance. Within each guild, there was a hierarchy. It was a structure. Everything in Europe is designed this way: community, church, the aristocracy, the military. Everything was designed with a hierarchical association. Everybody had a place. You outranked someone, and you were below the rank of someone else. Everybody was like that. That's the way it worked. Young apprentices usually started at the bottom as teenagers, would start apprenticing and training. Journeymen would then be more of the middle class group where they had done it for several years. They were a journeyman, they were skilled. And then, of course, the ones at the top were the masters, the accomplished masters at the top. Now, the journeyman apprentices are not independent. The apprentices are just learning. So they work under a master. And by the way, it's practically slavery. A typical apprentice is just a step above slavery. It's bad. You are locked in with a master, you're almost committed, you have a contract. It's really indentured servitude. Sometimes families would give away their sons to a master, which the son would learn and train, but for years he would be effectively a slave, just doing whatever the master needed. But once you reach journeyman status, then you will have, or then you're sort of independent. Then you're actually supposed to go out and start your own business, open your own shop, open your own stall, stuff like that. They're really day laborers working for wages, working for money. Very important change in economic history here, because for the first time, we now have, once you reach journeyman status, you are neither a slave anymore, you're independent, um, and you're not dependent upon anybody to assist you or help you. You're really an independent worker without having to be working on a farm, without having to work under a master, and you can open up your own shop and business now. The numbers of shops and businesses in this time period increased 10 times. in about a 200-year period. The population didn't increase that much, anywhere near that much. But the number of shops and businesses increases over 10 times. What it is many people are going out and becoming, the term you say, entrepreneur. They're opening up their own businesses, their own shops, because there's so much opportunity now, so much trade, so many goods going around. The masters really controlled pretty much everything. Within any particular industry, the masters were in charge of setting the policy, setting the prices. They controlled the offices, stuff like that. This is really the beginnings of modern capitalism, to where you're out for yourself. You're an independent worker, taking care of yourself, running your own business. You have rules to follow in the organization, the whole trade guild, but still, you make your own profit, you make your own goods, and you're responsible for taking care of yourself. This is really the beginnings of modern capitalism. We see new types of business arrangements. We see partnerships and contracts and large scale productive enterprises and giving out loans to start up new businesses. This is the beginning of capitalism, very clearly. It's the beginning of the modern idea of capitalism and the rise of industry in I almost said America. It is significant with America because in a couple hundred years, people start coming to America and they transfer all this stuff over there. Again, we are Western civilization, the United States. And where do we learn it? From Europe. Everything that our culture became is founded on European culture. So this is what really transfers over to America in a couple hundred years and becomes the foundation of our country. Economic capitalistic system. Partnerships bring individuals together to pool resources, finance larger ventures, finance bigger businesses, longer trade routes. They can, when dozens of people get together, they can buy ships where an individual often could not buy ships. In say northern and central Italy, for instance, we see these very long-term ventures that actually become family-oriented. I sort of mentioned that before. That Italy, their corporations, their industry are often family-owned. The father's the president. The sons or the cousins or the uncles are the CFOs and the CEOs and the COOs, and they're in charge of the different branches, the different divisions of the business. So the family is the corporation, and the corporation is the family in places like Italy. That doesn't really occur in most of Europe. We see that in Jewish communities, and we see that in Italian communities. Italians and Jewish are the ones that are more likely to organize their corporation and business along family lines. Most other places, most other people in Europe don't do that. The extended family was the extended business. The bigger your family, the bigger your business, because you only trusted the important jobs to blood, to family members. Which also meant that if there was a loss, your family had to take care of it. Your family had to absorb losses and pay debts. Contracts are very common, used for sale, exchange, loans, things like that. Loans is a very important change in Western civilization as well. You are now giving someone money with nothing in exchange. You're giving someone $1,000 or whatever the currency is in Europe at the time in different countries. You're giving them 1,000 of something and you're getting nothing in return other than a piece of paper that says, I will pay you back at some point in the future plus interest. Um, yeah, that's incredible risk. I mean, just to give someone $1,000 or what and hope that they pay it back to you in the future. And there's no real way you can make them do it either. There's really no laws governing this stuff. Most loans in this time period were private. So you're just loaning out your private money to another private individual, hoping they're going to pay you back and trusting they're going to pay you back. Now, why do you do this? For the profit you make off of it. In either interest, you make interest profit off of it. So you loan 1,000 and you end up eventually getting 1,200 back. You make money. You do that one time, it's not a big deal. You do it 1,000 times and you're rich, assuming everybody pays back or most people pay back. But also, a lot of times you give loans to actually be part of a partnership. So I give you $1,000, I'm buying a piece of your business. I'm going to give you the money to help you go buy a ship, but whatever profit you make off of that ship, I get a little piece of it. Every time that ship sails and brings back profit, I get a chunk of it. So the loans would also invest in partnerships or investments. So it's worth the risk, especially if you can make a lot of money off of it. We do see industry to begin. We really see the rise of industry in European society. Some of the earliest industries, cloth, or what we'll commonly call textiles. Cloth industry is one of the earliest, largest. Really useful because of the use of water now. In fact, they were using water to transport cloth. It's very bulky, it's very large, it's very heavy. It requires a large quantity to make profit. So it's hard just to you carry around on a horse or the back of a wagon. But if you can get a big ship or a barge, you can make a lot of profit. Plus, the water itself is useful because a lot of the mills were actually powered by water wheels. So the river would flow down and turn a water wheel, which would actually power the machines in the mill that would actually do some work. So the water was doubly useful. So you built your mill or your factory right on the water. The water itself could help power the factory. And then when the goods were ready, you literally just walk out on the dock right there attached to the factory, loaded onto a ship, and a ship takes it away. So we really see lots of towns and communities build up right along rivers, as we've already seen a couple of examples of. Metz and that city in Italy, we've already seen a couple of examples. They wanted to be close to water. It was the easiest, cheapest, most efficient transport available. What other kinds of things? We see improved farming techniques, improved foraging techniques for growing crops. Iron tools become very important in the entire economy. You need iron to in the factories. You need iron to actually process and grow the crops and harvest the crops. And iron production becomes, well, some cities are actually centered around iron production. We see that in Germany, Italy. We see it in places in Spain, even though Spain at this time is under Muslim rule. We still see in those places that entire communities will sometimes be based simply around the production of iron. It becomes so useful. It can be used everywhere. Ships, tools, weapons. Just iron is useful in everything. All right. Communes, self government for the towns. So townspeople. Townspeople really includes tradespeople, the artisans, in other words, the merchants, the artisans, ship captains, the innkeepers, the money changers. What's unusual? Well, these are not the old traditional medieval groups. These are not those who fought, those who pray, or those who labor. These are a new economic class, the new merchant economic class, that really don't fit into any of the old categories. These townspeople, they live in very close quarters. They shared mutual interests. They had same kind of coinage, the same kind of laws that often facilitated commerce. They had freedom from service and dues. They didn't have to pay services. They didn't have to pay dues to a lord or a man or estate. They weren't peasants. They weren't slaves. They were typically independent people. They had the liberty to buy and sell. They could do what they wanted. They were, really for the first time, a mass of truly free people. Peasants and serfs are not really free. If you're of the church, you're not really free because you are very under the very strict rules and guidance of the church. Even if you're in the aristocratic system, lords and the manors, you are free, of course, but even within that system, it's very structured, it's very rigid. As I said, if you're a lord in the aristocratic system in Europe, those who fight, you have a lord above you and vassals below you. And every one of those vassals has vassals below them and lords above them. So you're a piece in the pyramid with rules and requirements to those above and those below. If you're one of these new people, the innkeeper, the money changer, the ship captains, the artisans, the trade people, the merchants, you literally owe allegiance to nobody but yourself and your own family. You don't owe anyone below you. You don't owe anyone above you. You don't have to obey the rules of the church. You don't have to obey the rules of aristocracy. You are truly free. That's another huge difference in this new economic system that develops. Capitalism brings with it true economic freedom. If you have the means available, you can do whatever you want, live wherever you want, own whatever you want, be whatever you want. I know this may not seem like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's because that's sort of the way it is today. That's the way life is today. You could do whatever you want, go to school, whatever job you want, live wherever you want. I mean, that's America. Don't get me wrong, not the whole world isn't like that, of course, but that's the Western world generally. It wasn't like this through all of world history. Pretty much everyone was very structured in what you did or where you went or how you lived or where you worked, etc. Now, with this new economic revolution, you could literally do whatever you want as long as you have the means available. It's a really different world that is starting to develop in Europe here. Freedmen had their own officials, they had their own laws, they had their own courts, they would actually petition the rulers, often for the rights to govern themselves. The cities wanted actual independence and freedom. Previously, everybody in a region owed allegiance to some lord. The cities start to actually separate themselves, and we start calling them communes. Now, this is mostly in France. So you should understand a lot of this is happening primarily in France. France and Italy. Really, that's where almost everything we're talking about here is occurring, is in France and Italy. Um, the communes are a new quasi-independent social political body. They live within the greater lands of a kingdom. They're under the, I mean, they live within the territory of a churches, a cathedral. They live within the territory of a king or a lord. But most of them actually want a form of independence. They want to be able to govern themselves, make their own rules, make their own laws, have the liberty to control themselves. And we start calling these communes. These were institutions of self government. They typically consisted of higher ranking members of the city that would form like a legal, governmental, almost like a corporate body. In other words, the cities were almost, we actually use the term today. When they found a new city, we call it incorporating. When you create a new city or community, you are incorporating a new town. That's the terminology used today when towns are founded in the United States. Um, Corporation, we think of a business. Well, legally speaking, at its most basic, a town is a business. It is organized along the rules of a economic business with land and buying and selling values, and you have institutions and you have bills to be paid. A town is a business in essence. And so that's what they do here. They're really asking to be incorporated as independent sort of businesses with thousands of employees, if you will, people living and working in the town. Because if you live in the town, you have to pay your bills. You're paying your rent, you got to pay for your services, you got to pay your taxes. So you're sort of employees paying your dues, but then you also get all the benefits of living in the town. You're able to purchase services and enjoy all the benefits of a city or community: protection, walls, medical services. It's really interesting to think of it as a town as a business, but that is effectively how they're creating them. It's really interesting. We see this mostly in Italy and France, as I said before. Milan is a good example. In Milan in 1097, so we're going to say 1100 here, Milan. After a series of armed clashes, lots of violence going on in Milan, the actual townspeople give all their authority from the archbishop. They take their authority from the archbishop and the clergy, and they create a new governmental body headed by the city's leading men, the leading authority. They call themselves consuls. Again, they're borrowing from Rome. The consul was the leaders in the Roman Empire before the emperors. Um, Very interesting. So they start building walls, they incorporate themselves, they take the authority over the land from the church, and they declare themselves independent, quasi independent. They're not fully independent, but sort of independent governmental body. Really interesting. These outside of Italy, these movements for city independence continue to grow. Remember, these cities are still under kingdoms. Every city is within the territory of some kingdom or some lord. But now the cities are contributing to that lord economically. They're no longer just giving services and dues and food. These cities and towns now actually start to generate revenue. And when the city generates revenue, the lord gets a piece of that revenue. Because still, often the lords are the ones protecting the territories. So the lord is outside the capitalistic system, but he's going to benefit from it. That is why it works so well. The Lord is losing this town. In essence, this town is independent. He's losing power and authority over it. But he's gaining a larger population, a bigger tax base. He's gaining the revenue and benefits of the town. In essence, the Lord is losing the town in a way, but he's actually becoming richer and wealthier off of it. Very interesting. Sometimes these movements were violent. You should understand that too. Sometimes these lords were unwilling to give up their towns' independence, and sometimes deaths did occur. This movement for more and more independence of cities and communities and growth of capitalism sometimes was peaceful, sometimes was bloody. Belgium, for instance. In Belgium, the citizens of St. Omer, the city of St. Omer, they were granted privileges they asked in return for support of the Lord. So the Lord asks the town to support him economically, and then in return, the Lord grants them independence and freedom. He recognizes them as legally free citizens, gives them the right to have their own coinage, have their own laws and courts, things like this. He gives them independence as long as they recognize him as king and pay dues to him. So it's really a win-win for the Lord. He doesn't have to worry about managing and dealing with all the problems of thousands of people because they're going to have their own government now, because typically the lords were the government. The lords were the leaders, the lords were the juries, the courts. Every single week, all the people would come to the Lord, and the Lord would basically preside over them as the court officer. The Lord had all these duties. The city takes most of these duties off his hands, while simultaneously guaranteeing him support, loyalty, and revenue. Honestly, it's a win-win for most lords. They get relieved of a lot of their duties, and they continue making money and get to continue to have their status. It's really, at the end of the day, what do rich people want? They simply want to be richer and continue to have high status. This allows many lords to do that, make more money, and maintain their high status while having a much easier go of it. Yeah, very interesting. Whether or not it's peaceful or violent, this becomes sort of the standard way in places like France and Italy. It really starts to really sort of become standard in the cities. What about in more rural areas? Well, by 1150, rural life was increasingly organized around the marketplace and fairs. Rural marketplaces slash fairs were where often life was organized. Um, in the previous centuries, life was organized around religious institutions, churches, monasteries, cathedrals. Now we start to see it organized due to the economic commercial revolution. We start to see cities, these smaller villages and towns now, not cities, but the smaller villages and towns and farming communities organized around the marketplaces. You still have peasants and lords, though. When you're outside the cities, you're still dealing with peasants and lords. The lords would hire and train agents to administer their estates, calculate profit and losses, to make marketing decisions. Even the lord's estates are now being run like a business venture. So even the lord's estate is now in essence, a sort of a corporation. There would be all kinds of different offices within the lord's estate, different positions. They become like a little independent government corporation. Aristocrats continue to base all their power on wealth and status. It's all about wealth and appearance and status and displays of wealth. However, we see a shift in power. By the 12th century, the lords are no longer the richest people in Europe, as they had been for 500 years. By the 12th century, we actually see more wealth in the cities. This is probably one of the reasons the cities get away with this. They have, in essence, more power. The guilds and the city leaders have more wealth, all generated from trade. What do we call this term today? The nouveau riche, the new rich. Not rich based upon your family or inheritance or some old family line. It's literally people who started out poor and became rich, usually off of this economic revolution. Really changes things, which means the lords now have to pay attention and actually listen to them. This new economy is creating people that have just as much money as the old aristocratic lords, even more money. And now the lords have to listen to them because money brings power. money equals power. So though we now have people that have just as much money or even more money than the old aristocratic lords and families, even kings. Very interesting. Many aristocrats were really concerned about honor and authority. They often would try to donate and give money and actually do charity to get favor, to get people to still want to obey them and support them and be loyal to them. Sometimes even go into debt. They would even go into debt and actually spend all their money simply to try and achieve status and prestige. Yeah, pretty crazy. As the lord's need for wealth continued to grow, because as more and more wealth was transferred from the lords to the cities, we see peasants becoming more independent. We see peasants actually starting to pull away from the lord's estates. As I mentioned before, in the 100-year period, we see the population in Europe's cities double. Well, it isn't population growth, it isn't reproduction. While that might be a piece of it, most of that population growth are peasants picking up and going to the cities, simply leaving the farms and going to the cities, which further weakens the lords and the aristocrats in the manor estates, as many of their workforce now seems to pick up and leave and go into the cities. Now, population does grow in Europe. Population increases dramatically in these couple hundred years. We see increasing demand for food, which means we actually need more farmland. It's a weird irony. As more and more peasants go to the cities and the cities grow, we need more food because if you're in the city, you're not really producing food. Most people in the city don't produce food, yet they all have to eat. So this food, increasingly, the cities become increasingly dependent upon the farmlands for food. But the lords are losing power. So to increase the amount of farmland, to get greater land cultivation due to the overpopulation, we see lords giving privileges to the peasants, allowing them to have more independence, more status, more wealth. And we start to see the growth by the 12th, 13th century of independent farmers that are not beholden to a lord. Now, don't get me wrong, we still see lots and lots of peasants in Europe, but we do start seeing increasing numbers of independent farmers due to the fact that the lords are having to be a little more lenient on them because they need them to farm much bigger pieces of land to produce more food and products. Um, Maybe even pay fewer taxes, whether the taxes are in food or labor, for instance. Overpopulation does can start to be a problem in Europe, though. It's a weird cycle. The more your population grows, the more food you need. The more food you need or produce, the more your population grows. The more the population grows, the more food you need. It's a cycle. Food creates population. Population needs food. More food creates more population. Um, Europe's population does double in the by the end of the Middle Ages. So we're starting this chapter sort of in what around the year 900s, and we're going all the way to like the 1200s. So in this 300-year period, Europe's population doubles. Now remember that city thing I said doubling? That was in 100 years. In just 100 years, city populations double, even though over 300 the European population increases and doubles. And what that means is there is a lot of farmers going into the cities, a lot of peasants going into the cities as well. By the 12th century, due to this overpopulation, we see as many as 20 different peasant families that might live on what had been a farm of a single family before. So 20 peasants living on one single farm. Um, Farms have to support a lot more people. We have a lot more people working the farms. And one of the reasons this works is we have these new technologies. We have new technologies of plows and new planting technologies and fertilizers, which allow the same piece of farmland to produce a lot more food. Thereby, you need more workers. So you have the same piece of farmland, which is now having to produce a lot more food on a regular basis. It has new technologies to grow and harvest and cultivate the crops, but you also need more people to work that. This is before there's any machines or anything, so you've got to have people working that land. So even though we have increasing numbers of people going to the cities, we actually see the actual farm economy expand because the overall population is booming. So a lot more people available, many more people in the cities, but ultimately that means there's actually more people in the country due to the incredible population boom. That's also where the food's being produced. So that's logical as well. People are right there at the center of the food production, so it's more logical. How big is it? By the 12, 1300s, it's typical for peasant families to have anywhere from 7 to 10 kids. That wasn't possible in the early Middle Ages. Even though you had poor peasant families living out on the farms, the resources are very meager. Most of what you produced on a farm in the 800s went to your lord. You didn't have a lot of extra left over. And even when you traded for food, you didn't have a lot left over. Families were much smaller, and people died a lot younger. By the end of the Middle Ages, life expectancy increased by like 10, 15 years in the farming areas. Now, these are in years when the plague doesn't come through. When the plague comes through, the Black Plague, of course, it just wipes everybody out. But when you discount the years of the plague, and the plague comes back all the time, when you take the plague years out, the actual population grows dramatically. Again, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. Sure, some of them don't make it to adulthood. Child mortality rates were pretty decently high, but still much better than in the city. Very interesting. Peasants and lords often turned services and dues into money, and by the 12th century, it's an entire money economy in Europe. 800s, the entire economy was barter and exchange. I mean, don't get me wrong, certainly few people had money, but most of the economy was barter and exchange and trades of goods and services. By the 1200s, the entire European economy is becoming a money economy to where people don't just take goods or services. They expect you to take whatever your goods or services you produce, take it to the market, and exchange it for cash, and then use the cash to pay your bills. Um, However, what this means is the more and more peasants have money, it gives them independence because they're no longer beholden to the next crop they grow. They have an actual bag of gold now, which means they don't have to wait for the next crop. They could literally just pick their shit up and go move and go somewhere else and leave and go to the city or go start their own business to actually become part of this new commercial economy because they have money in hand. Before they had a corn cob. I mean, that's what it was. Everything you did in previous centuries, you paid with services and food. I mean, how can you go start a business with a bushel of corn? You know, so you have money now. You can actually do this. We have this new money economy. It's very interesting, which also gives another advantage to many common people: inheritance. If you have a bag of money, you can actually pass that on to your children, which wasn't something you could do before. The only thing you could pass on to your children before was the actual land. And the thing is, most of the land was owned by the lords. So what were you passing on to your kids? Really nothing. Most of your children just ended up being common workers and laborers like you were, either a farmer or a laborer. You didn't really pass on wealth. Now we see increasing numbers of people that have actual money that can pass to their family and their descendants. Let's see what else we have going on here. We see collectives, commune collectives being formed in communities. Well, all this, you're not going to really worry about that. We see peasants gain a new sense of identity, solidarity. They join together sometimes to bargain with the Lord for increased rights, increased opportunities, to where the lords and the peasants start to really form more of a partnership, not a lord vassal situation. That of the medieval ages goes away by the 1300s. What we think of as lords and vassals, that sort of goes away. The only place you'll still see that is of the high ranking aristocrats. The high ranking aristocrats, the kings and the dukes and the princes, all that, yeah. But that's really only among the 5%. Among the rest of the people, that whole vassal lord relationship of fealty and feudalism really starts to go away. It survives for about 500 years from say the 7 800s to the 12 1300s. But after that, feudalism and vassalage and fealty, it really goes away as a common way of life for most Europeans. Now, among the rich and elite, they still continue to live that way. It's sort of a tradition, but most Europeans don't buy into it anymore. It really isn't that way anymore. This new economy that came with this resolution has greater access to markets, greater productivity, increased personal freedom, greater wealth. Although this does come with increased obligations, which now your obligations are cash obligations, like our society today. You got to pay your rent, your cable bill, your phone bill. You got to pay for gas, a car payment. You got to pay for school. So, with this increasing freedom and independence as we have in the world today, in America, for instance, it also comes with a lot of responsibilities. Because if you were a peasant, what responsibilities did you have? You had to farm and give your lord some of your food. That's it. That's it. You had no other bills. You didn't have to worry about buying stuff. Your lord gave you what you needed to work on the farm. You literally had no responsibility beyond simply taking care of your farm and giving your dues to the Lord. That's it. It was really simple, actually. It was poor. You lived in poverty, but it was simplistic. Now the economy is much more complicated. It's more of a web now. You are constantly connected to people that you have to pay bills and responsibilities for, and you are also responsible for your customers and things like that. So, you know, they ate better, they lived better, they had a higher quality of life, they lived longer, but they also had to spend that money. Again, it's really the creation of the modern world economy, of the modern economy we see in the Western civilization, because this is really sort of what the world is today. It's really interesting how it all starts here, and this all really starts 900 years ago, and it really becomes the basis for entire modern capitalism, which is what our economy is based on in America. So the Crusades. Wait a minute. Didn't it say church reform a minute ago? Yeah. I decided to go ahead and skip section 2, the church reform, because it's boring and complicated, and there's lots of names and dates, and I just, We're going to move on to something a little more interesting. Let's talk about the Crusades. The Crusades, the Catholic Christian attempts to retake the Holy Land of Jerusalem. Successful initially, eventually they lose it, and it creates a 200-year war between Christians and Muslims. So, how does it all start? The First Crusade was called in response to Byzantium's request. The Byzantine Empire, the emperor, requests help from European church, from the Catholic Church, and also from just European kings to come to a fellow Christian aid. Even though the Christianity was really separate, they were almost two different Christian churches. They still respected each other generally. They were both Christian. So the idea was come and help a fellow Christian out. And he pleaded with the Pope and pleaded with kings in Europe, and they come to fight this invasion of the Seljuk Turks, Muslim Turks. In 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV, he met the Seljuk Turks with a mercenary army that he had paid for at Manzikert. He was defeated. He was captured. And this really leads to the end, not the end, or I guess maybe this actually starts the slow fall of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire lasts for almost 400 more years. But this really begins the shrinking of the empire. They've already lost a lot of the European lands. They now start losing Asian lands. And Byzantium, the Romans as they would have called themselves, really starts to shrink. By 1095, this appeal from the emperor in Byzantium to the Pope Urban II, hoping to receive more troops, more mercenary troops, maybe some help of European kings and the church to fight back the Muslims, who he appeals to the idea of Christianity versus Islam, the fact that it's the Christians must stand together against the Islamic invaders. Urban chose to interpret this request differently. Urban chose to interpret it as, he chooses it as a personal crusade of his own to increase his power and status and the power and status of the church. The church was increasingly losing power in Europe to local kings in Europe. So this was a way to elevate the church's status while taking up arms against the Muslim invaders. He wants to take back the Holy Land from the, quote, wicked race, unquote, of the Muslims. Urban's call certainly gave the papacy, which is the church in Rome, the papacy, a lot more power and authority in European affairs than it had in many years. And this was, of course, Urban wanted to increase the notoriety, the prestige, the power, and authority of the Catholic Church. Everybody came. This was a massive. It was portrayed as a calling of God. God calls the people of Europe to fight against the wicked race of the Muslims, the infidels of the Muslims who have already taken parts of Europe. There's already parts of Southeast Europe that were taken. Of course, they had taken Spain. So this was a way to take back what the Muslims had been taking from the Christians and to exact holy vengeance. This was a holy war. This was the Christian version of this jihad. This was a holy war to destroy the Muslims and to take back the Christian holy lands of Jerusalem. Um, yeah, many people joined for sincere reasons of piety, sincere reasons of faith, truly believing they're doing the work of God. And others joined for purely opportunistic reasons, for opportunities to gain wealth and status. Rich, poor men, and women. Women fought in these crusades. We see women taking up weapons. Again, if you're called to God, you're called to God. And there had been a tradition in Europe for centuries where women were called to God as nuns and convents and things like this. So we see women taking up weapons. We see women participating in this. It's a small number. Sure, this is almost entirely men. But we do see men, women, poor, and rich alike. Kings. Many times kings are marched to the Holy Lands. They leave their kingdoms back in France or Germany or England, and they march across the world effectively to fight in the Holy Lands, which is the Middle East. It's quite interesting. And this begins a 200-year conflict between Christians and Muslims. So here we have people from Europe coming all the way from Germany, Cologne. Eventually, we'll get kings coming from England. This is, I think, the first crusade. Yeah, this is the first one, 1096 to 1099. This lasts for about, altogether, there are 7 official crusades, I think. 7 or 9, something like that. The number varies. I've heard as many as 11. I guess it depends on what you classify as official. So anywhere between 7 and 11 crusades. This is just the first one to go and retake Jerusalem down here from the Muslims. Here you have Byzantine Empire, you have Constantinople. That's where they called to Rome and asked Rome assistance, and Rome then calls to the people of Europe and says, "Let's go fight this holy war against the Muslims," which of course did bring a lot of prestige to the Catholic Church because they're successful. The Muslims were entirely unprepared for this. They never expected thousands of Christian soldiers from Europe to suddenly come marching over the hills and attack them. It was entirely unexpected, unpredicted, and the Christians were successful. They retook Jerusalem. Boom. Done. It's over. Drop the mic. Unfortunately, the Muslims don't stop. The Muslims don't give up. They consider these lands to be their lands. And furthermore, the Christians don't give up. After all, when you win a fight, you keep fighting. So the Christians see this as a win, and eventually we get more crusades, going to take more lands in the Holy Lands, to take more of Muslim world. I mean, ultimately, the Christians would have probably wanted to wipe Muslims out, to literally scour the earth of all living Muslims would have been probably the goal of many Christians. Doesn't even begin to happen, but yeah, this is really where it starts. And so they march across Europe. They go by boat if they need to, march through Constantinople, march all the way through the Seljuk dominion. There's Manzikert, where it was a major loss. All of this was Byzantium, all the way to Edessa. All of this was Byzantium. And they lost all this at the Battle of Manzikert. The Muslims were able to take all this territory back from the Byzantine Christians. And there we go. Let's go on to the next one. So the armies were not organized well. They were generally a bunch of independent small armies, all following their own independent course. As you saw from the map, they went many different ways. Some went over land, some went over water, some went through Italy, some went through Byzantium. All these little independent groups. Most of them met around Constantinople and organized around Constantinople, and then many of them went in mass into the Holy Lands from Constantinople. Let's go on. Often they spoke different languages. You could have a French army, a German army, an Italian army. One band which was not commissioned by the Pope, this is one of the unofficial groups, was the Peasants. We call it the Peasants' Crusade. This peasants group, which was made up of many, many poor common people, which was really not authorized by the Pope. They made these deliberate attacks on Jews. They actually stopped in the Rhineland. The Rhineland is in Central Europe, generally around where Germany is. They attacked Jews living in the Rhineland, and they called them infidels, and they, in essence, treated the Jews the same as the Muslims, as enemies of Christianity. We see hundreds of Jews murdered, executed by the Christian Crusaders. This actually is a pattern that goes through all the Crusades. Almost every crusade has recorded incidents of crusaders specifically attacking non-Catholics, attacking other pagan groups, attacking Jews, even Byzantium, which again is Christian, but it's a different type of Christianity by now. Eastern Orthodox Christianity. There's even times the Crusades attack the Christians in Byzantium and kill Christians there. So anyone who wasn't Catholic was actually a potential target of the Crusades. The Crusades get out of hand in some ways. Now, of course, the President's Crusade probably meets a just end because most of them are not really trained soldiers. When they get to the Middle East, they almost all die. Almost the entire army slaughtered by the Muslims. Which again, maybe that's just cause. Maybe that's they got what they deserved for slaughtering innocent Jews. Nonetheless, no one worried about dying because the Pope made it very clear all of your sins will be forgiven if you went on the Crusades. Another reason it was very popular for people, you could have sins of any type, including murder, rape, and if you chose to swear loyalty to the Pope in the Catholic Church and go on a crusade, the Pope would forgive you of your sins. Now, whether or not God actually forgave your sins is a whole other thing. But at least as far as people were concerned, if the Pope gave you a check mark and said you're good to go, then most people would have considered themselves good to go. One thing that did bring people into the Crusades, among many things, that was one aspect that would bring people there, to be forgiven for all sins. And furthermore, you could commit any sin. You could commit almost any sin while on a crusade, and you would be forgiven as well, including murder and all kinds of other crimes. You'd be forgiven. As long as you were on the crusade fighting for the Holy Lands, to retake the Holy Lands, you would be forgiven of anything you did, which in many ways made some people act very bad. There's lots of incidents and stories of knights and soldiers just committing atrocities, murders, things like this. But all right, when the main armies of the Crusades do finally arrive around 1096, they clash with the Byzantine Emperor initially. The Byzantine Emperor at this time was Alexius, and Alexius didn't really want them there for that. Alexius wanted his own private mercenary army to work for him. Instead, we now have thousands of Christian soldiers running through the Byzantine lands on their own personal mission. You understand, the call of the Crusades from Byzantium was to help Byzantium retake its lands from the Muslims. Jerusalem was never Byzantine land. It was never trying to retake Jerusalem. It was simply trying to push the Seljuk Turks out of Asia Minor. The Crusades had no interest in that. The Crusades completely avoid and go around or through the Seljuk Turk regions. I'm sure there's some fighting, but that was never their goal. So they came to Byzantium at the call of Byzantium, but due to the fact what Pope Urban did, he changed the entire purpose of it. They had no interest in it. They didn't give a shit what the Byzantine Emperor wanted. They were there to get treasure and wealth and holy salvation and to destroy Muslims and to retake Jerusalem. None of that was anything what the Byzantine Emperor wanted. Yeah. Supposedly, they agreed to return any lands they conquered to Byzantium. They agreed to give up any lands they conquered back to Byzantium, is what they agreed to. The first Crusaders, supposedly. They don't do that. They keep the lands they take from the Muslims. So Byzantium actually, chunks of land Byzantium lost, they lose a second time to the Christians from Europe. And they don't ever get that back. They never regain these lands. The whole purpose of the Crusades was to get the lands back, according to Byzantium, and they never get them back. The Muslims are actually part of the reason for the loss as well. Muslims were often in essence, by this time period, many Muslims there was multiple kingdoms. There was a kingdom in North Africa, there was a kingdom in Spain, there was a kingdom in Cairo or Egypt, There was a kingdom in Central Asia. There was a Seljuk kingdom. I mean, you got like 5 different kingdoms. So due to the fact that Muslims were very disjointed and disunionized, if that's a word, they were not able to put up a proper defense. They were taken unawares, unexpectedly. Had the Muslims actually been prepared for this and had a united army, the Christians would have failed, would have miserably failed. A bunch of small independent armies marching met a bunch of small independent armies, as opposed to a united Muslim state, which they do eventually do. They eventually get there. They seize Antioch in 1098. They kill every single Turk, man, woman, and child. They murder everyone. Again, a soldier on a battlefield isn't murder. That's war. You take up arms, sword to sword, that's war. We don't consider that murder. But women and children and civilians and merchants and business people and farmers, that's murder. The Christians murdered thousands of Turks as they made their way to Jerusalem. They burned entire cities. It was pretty bad. It was brutal. But again, they believed anyone who was Muslim was an enemy of God, and they would be absolved of any sins they committed. The Pope told them so. So there's no reason not to do anything they wanted. This is for piece of paper. This is the Muslims. By the way, you had paper. They had paper. Europeans don't have paper for centuries. Muslims already are able to make paper, and they don't have a printing press yet, exactly, but they do have that. You can see Muslim soldiers on the left, here defending walls of a city. Muslim soldiers on the left defending walls of a city. And you can see Christian knights over here falling down off of the horses, dying. So you have Christian knights being murdered by Muslims. So this is obviously a piece of Muslim artwork, Muslim story probably, of Muslim victories. Well, Muslims didn't really have victories initially. The First Crusade was certainly a success and a win for the Christian crusaders from Europe. Subsequent crusades do not work quite as well. All right, so the victorious leaders of the First Crusade, they organized what we call crusader states. They organized little independent kingdoms along the coast of the Mediterranean. They never really get inland very far. They don't really get into what was still, I guess, was still the Abbasid Caliphate, the Abbasid Empire. So they don't really get into Central Asia. They don't really get into the Seljuk Turkish territories. They generally have all of their business within that very slim coast of the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean up to Byzantium. They considered themselves lords. Sometimes these were simple low-level knights and low-level vassals. But they conquered a territory, they conquered a city, they set themselves up as lords and knights and called themselves nobles. So many of these different states have common's the wrong word. They're still aristocrats, they're knights, but have these regular lower tier knights, which might be third or fourth or fifth down on a list, elevate themselves to the top of the list, elevate themselves to the lordships of these different crusader states. Over time, they take these and they grant lands out to other knights, and they create their own little feudal dominions in the Middle East. Now, most people return home after the Crusades because most people have families. Most people do return home. For years, these Crusader lords stayed and maintained relationships with Muslim lords. And we actually see several years of sort of peace and prosperity exist between Muslims and Christians in these Crusader states. So for years, a couple decades in some cases, we have these little independent Christian kingdoms on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean surrounded by Muslims. As a matter of fact, the people that they're lording over are mostly Muslim. Now, they do actually relocate some Christian families. They do actually relocate some, because again, some of these are lords, so they have peasants. So some of them do actually relocate their peasants from Central Europe to the Middle East to try and start building Christian communities. They do this for several years, and there's some success for a few years, for a while. A new group, a lot of people have heard of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar is a group that's a brand new group in this time. Their name comes from the fact that they lived they lived near the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. They actually set up barracks and a camp right near the rebuilt Jewish temple in Jerusalem. They devote themselves to warfare, Christian warriors. That's why we call them the Knights Templar. They're basically the Knights of the Temple. Um, their missions included protecting pilgrimages routes because once they retook Jerusalem, we had many European Christians start making pilgrimages from Europe to Jerusalem. Jesus. So they're making these pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. They man garrisons of at the Crusader states. They're sort of the military wing of the Crusader states. You have multiple lords, and the Templars work for all of them. They are the Christian warriors, this own created Christian warrior sect to sort of defend the honor of the Crusader states. However, they're mercenaries. You must understand that. While they wear the cross and they claim to represent God, they only come when you pay. They are mercenaries and they live. They're paid mercenaries. That's simply what they are. All in the name of God. They believe they're doing the work of God, and as a result of that, that means they also have a belief that they can do anything. Because anything they do is in serving of God, therefore they can get away with anything, including murdering and theft and stuff like this. They do some pretty heinous stuff. They invade Muslim cities and steal everything. They steal all their money. They invade treasuries. They take women. Many of the Crusaders, even though they were, some of them remained celibate. They weren't an official group of the church. They weren't an officially sanctioned group of the church. They were almost their own creation. They weren't required to be celibate, although some did actually. Some took their vows very seriously. Some believed they were truly warriors of God, and they remained celibate and things like that. But many others were just simply mercenary soldiers that went to the highest bidder. And they would actually, we even see times Crusader states fought amongst themselves. We would see competing groups of Templars fighting each other because some lord would pay them and another lord would pay another group. And then the Templars would actually end up fighting and killing each other, all for money. There was a noble beginning, maybe, and there were some that remained noble through the entire course of the Knights Templar, but towards the end, they were basically just paid mercenaries. They also were responsible for transporting money back and forth. They were regarded to be a very wealthy institution, the Knights Templar, thought to have lots of money and treasure. This is one of the reasons maybe heard myths about the Knights Templar and the gold and all the treasure they had and stuff. There is actually some truth to the fact that the Knights Templar were actually very wealthy because they ran many of the merchant routes. They themselves weren't merchants, but they ran the routes as a business. They guarded the routes and they sort of organized the routes, the trade routes between the Middle East and Europe. And so they actually enriched themselves. They became quite wealthy. Eventually, some Templars make themselves into lords. Some Templars eventually even take over some of these Crusader states. Most of them started out as common soldiers. Suddenly, they change their armor, put a big cross on them, start saying they're warriors of God. They start running the merchant routes, making a lot of money, and some of them elevated their status all the way to lords and started running different areas and regions of the Middle East. Here you see some of the different Crusader kingdoms. Jerusalem was a Crusader state, Tripoli Crusader state, the Crusader state of Antioch, Edessa, a little Armenia. So there's multiple. Altogether, there was at different times and different periods, because this lasts over 200 years, there's over a dozen different Crusader states, although not all of them survive the whole time. Some are short-lived. I mean, there's a couple that only survive a few years. Almost immediately after they establish dominion, the Muslims come in and wipe them out. Very interesting, though, how this happens. But you can see they never really get into Muslim territory. All of this is Islamic. All of this is Islamic. They never really they take these lands, but they don't ever really do any damage to the Muslims. Obviously, they kill many along the coast, but the Muslim empires fully intact. The Seljuk Empire, the Fatimid Empire, the Abbasid Empire, they were never in any way threatened by the Crusaders. Not really. This never threatened their dominance of the Middle East or of Asia in any way, really. Well, let's go to the Second Crusade. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but we're going to couple of them here. The Crusader states began to decline because within just a few years, what you're talking about here, within 50 years, we see the Seljuk Turks amassing counterattacks. And being the fact that the Turks and the Abbasids completely surrounded the Crusader states, they were able to come from every direction, and they way outnumbered. I mean, there was tens of millions of Muslims in this region of the Middle East, uh, far outnumbering the Christians. Many of these Christian kingdoms had a couple thousand Christians. That was it, surrounded by millions of Muslims. I mean, honestly, it was always bound to fail. There was no way it was ever going to succeed. But for a few years, it seemed like it. The fall of Edessa was 1144. This really sparks this was the ineffectual Second Crusade. They tried taking over Edessa. They lost Edessa. The Second Crusade fails. They managed to capture Edessa for a few years, but then Edessa is almost immediately reconquered by the Seljuk Turks. This is where we start seeing in the Second Crusade on, we start seeing kings in Europe, like French kings and German kings and English kings, start sending their own armies. What they want is these kings actually want to get a piece of the Holy Lands. They want to be able to have their own kingdom in the Holy Lands. The French want their own French kingdom in the Holy Lands. The English want their own English kingdom in the Holy Lands. So now the competition is not just between the Christians and the Muslims. Now we have competition between different Christian kings. The same way they fought wars in Europe for land, we're now going to see Christian kings start to fight each other in the Middle East over the land. So now we have Christian kings fighting each other. We have Muslims involved, and we're also going to throw in the Byzantines, because the Byzantines are the ones that got all this started, and they want the lands. So we end up having a four-way split. We have Christian kings fighting each other, the Muslims involved, the Byzantines involved. It becomes a land grab. Everyone pretty much stabbing each other in the back to try and take over the lands. It becomes pretty ugly. There is no real clear coordinated plans. Most of the different kings just form up their own armies and march across Europe to the Holy Lands all on their own. The French groups failed. The Germans groups failed. This is all part of this Second Crusade. They all end up failing. When they finally do meet and they agree to attack Damascus, Damascus is the capital of, is it the Seljuk Empire or is it no, I think Damascus is, well, I guess it's the capital of the Seljuk Empire at this point. The Seljuk Turks really is Damascus. Although it was also, at one point, it was also the capital of the Abbasids. So Damascus might serve dual purposes. They attack Muslim-controlled Damascus. They meet very stiff resistance, and the attack lasts for 5 days and then eventually fails. They can't take Damascus. Thousands die attempting to take the city, which was the capital, and they can't do it. So, why is it so significant? When you consider that there is almost a dozen different crusades, why so significant? Well, think about this. One of the ways it affected Europe, for instance. Louis VII, he launched a crusade. He went to Europe, he went to the Middle East, he led a crusade, he launched it, he lost. The crusade was defeated. Lost his army. Well, he divorces his wife afterwards, immediately. Why? He believes that God had cursed him. He comes to believe that his wife cheated on him. And since she was unfaithful, that somehow is like a curse on him. So he believes his wife is to blame. She is unfaithful to him, therefore God has cursed him. So he takes it upon himself to divorce her, and her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Well, Eleanor of Aquitaine may or may not have cheated. We don't have any direct evidence of that. We don't really know. Most likely he was simply using this as an excuse to get a divorce, because getting divorces was very difficult in Catholic Europe. It was very difficult. The church had to really sanction it and authorize it, and it was very complicated. If you were married, you were mostly married until one of you died. So he's able to get the church to approve this, and he gets this divorce from Eleanor of Aquitaine. Well, what does Eleanor do? Eleanor then, she's a royal. I mean, she's an aristocrat. She goes ahead and moves on to the next guy. She finds another king. She ends up marrying King Henry, who was the king of Normandy, which is a region in northern France. So Eleanor leaves Louis, or he divorces her. She marries Henry, who was a king in northern France, sets into motion a series of events where eventually, as a result of her marrying Henry and getting those lands, because she owned the lands of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is part of France. So she takes those lands, gives them to Henry. Henry's now in charge of both Normandy and Aquitaine. And eventually, Henry uses this power and authority of his to leverage an entire kingdom, and he uses his power and might to build an army using Eleanor's resources, and he takes over England. He becomes the King of England. So, due to the fact that the crusade failed, Louis takes his actions, Eleanor takes her actions, which leads Henry to actually take over and become King of England. All as a result of a failed crusade. So, what influence did the Crusades have? Massive. The Crusades ultimately killed hundreds of thousands of people. They create wars and violence between different European kings. They elevate the status of the Catholic Church dramatically. They create a feud between Christians and Muslims that lasts for centuries. Hell, you might say it still isn't even over, really. It continues to actually help destroy the Byzantine Empire, because the Crusades could have actually grown the Byzantine Empire and improved it in size. Actually, could have brought some glory back to the Byzantine Empire. That's what they wanted initially. They simply wanted mercenaries to work for them. Instead, they don't help Byzantium, and Byzantium actually continues to shrink, and results in a new king of England as a result of these actions. So there are incredible effects of this domino effect of crusades. The crusades shaped and changed the entire culture of Europe. And another thing which is really significant, well, I'm going to get to that, the long-term impacts of the crusades. The crusades affect Europe centuries after they're over. As I just said, the Muslim-Christian relations that were so damaged by 200 years of warfare, I don't know. Maybe have never really recovered. And maybe they never would have. It isn't like Christians and Muslims hadn't fought before. So maybe this made it worse for a while. Maybe it makes no difference. Maybe in the long term it wouldn't have made a difference. But I don't know. 200 years of murdering and killing each other, that's got to have long-standing cultural effects. The First Crusade was a success. Not really. It was a mirage. It really wasn't a success. For a while, Europeans could say, yes, we won. Yes, we defeated the Muslims. Yes, we retook the Holy Lands. Yeah, for a few years. Until the Muslims got things back together again and made a few alliances, and then boom, it was all over. Once the Muslims started to move, the Abbasids and the Seljuks, once they really started to take action against the Christians, it only took them a few years to push the Christians out of the Holy Lands. Most of the rest of the Crusades were simply to retake the lands they had lost after the First Crusade. So in other words, it was to retake the lands that they had taken and then lost. There were numerous other crusades. There were 8 major crusades, altogether almost a dozen crusades, between 1096 and 1291. So 195 years. The Holy Lands were never fully under the control of Christians, and by the 1200s, the Muslims retake everything, and all the Crusader states are defeated. Long-term effects, economic effects. Many people were inspired by these expeditions into the Middle East, into Asia, because I mean, the Middle East is Asia, technically. So many of these were inspired by these invasions into the Middle East. They discovered all kinds of new products, new goods, new treasures, new wealth. These were the Silk Roads that ran through here. So there was all kinds of new goods and new products, drugs, new chemicals. Gunpowder was one of the things discovered in this time period. So many things are discovered with these new trade routes that are established between the Crusader states and Asia. And they last for over 100 years. Well, when the Crusades fail finally, and the Holy Lands are eventually retaken by the Muslims, all those trade routes are cut off or diminished. This is one of the things that leads to this economic crisis in Europe. For years, a century or more, you could buy all these luxury goods, all these exotic things, all these new technologies and ideas were coming into Europe, and then suddenly, like a gate closing, it was cut off. The Crusader states are pushed out. The Holy Lands are all Muslim again. Now, if you want anything, you have to do business with Muslims. Um, it really changes how Europe works economically. And people want these goods again. 200 years later, what do they start doing? They start sailing around the world. The Crusades really set up Europe for the voyages of exploration. And the voyages of exploration are what end up with global colonization by European countries and lead to the dominance of Europe over the entire world by the 1700s, which we could argue still exists today. This dominance of European white Christian culture, which comes to dominate the globe. Um, what else we got going on here? Lots of trade. I sort of talked about that. Lots of imagination about all the holy lands, the mysterious lands to the east. It certainly damages Islamic authority in the east. It doesn't collapse any countries. It doesn't bring down any empires, but it does show that the Islamic disunity is a problem. The fact that they're all Muslim, but they are also fighting amongst them, just like the Christian kings are in Europe. The kings are fighting over kingdoms and lands. Muslim kings are doing the same thing. They're fighting over lands and territories, similarly. Before the Crusades, the Shiite and the Sunni Muslims are very split. Was much more serious. Put it this way: the biggest controversy in Muslim society before the Crusades was between the Sunnis and the Shias. Shias, really. That was where the biggest challenge. We had different empires that were one was Sunni empire, one was a Shiite empire, and they fought. They now find a common enemy in the coming years, and their common enemy is Christians in Europe. In a way, what the Christians did was they actually helped unite. They helped unite Muslim powers and kingdoms against a common foe, European Christians. If anything, it actually strengthened the Islamic world for the next 200 years, made it stronger. All right, in our last section, we'll talk about then should be the revival of monarchies in Europe. All right, Byzantine Empire tries to recover after 1081, tries to recover after Manzikert and all that going on. We have Emperor Alexis here from 1081. He ruled till 1118, so that's like a 40-year ruling. That's 40 years as emperor, which is pretty impressive. He manages to keep from the Byzantium from being conquered, which was actually challenging because Byzantium was being attacked from all sides. The Muslims were constantly making incursions into Byzantine lands. They were constantly being attacked from the north too by barbarian tribes from Central Asia. And they were actually, once the Crusades really got rolling, it was common for Crusader lords to actually come through Byzantium lands and try taking over parts of Byzantium. There was even invasions of Constantinople, where Christian kings actually invaded and at one point even conquered part of Constantinople, burned part of the city down, raided its treasury, stole all its money. Yeah. So Byzantium had to constantly deal with threats from every direction, and they managed to survive. They managed to hold it all together. Alexius relied mostly on mercenaries and mounted soldiers, very much like the European knights and the Asian barbarian tribes. Mounted soldiers, knights, things like this. In return for the services of these knights and mercenaries, and sometimes even put the barbarian horse soldiers from Middle Asia on the payroll, in return, he would give them lands, he would give them estates, he would actually give them peasants, he would make concessions to these groups. He would bring in these lords from other territories and actually settle them in Byzantine lands and say, here, this territory is yours. All you have to do is protect it and owe allegiance to Constantinople, owe loyalty to us, and pay your taxes. and you get to enjoy the benefits of being part of the Byzantine Empire, and you can call yourselves Romans. This did actually satisfy a lot of people. It made a lot of people happy, and Byzantium manages to sort of stabilize in the 1100s. It doesn't get bigger, but they manage to stabilize and hold on to what they have still, which by this point they're small. By this point in time, Byzantium is probably no bigger than France. So to even call Byzantium an empire anymore is kind of a joke. It's really a kingdom now. It's really not an empire anymore. It's again there's regions in Europe. Again, France is probably just as big. So yeah. Alexis and his heirs, they manage to gain prestige, military might, but they give up so much of their land, including land that they lose in warfare to the Muslims, that by the 1200s, the Byzantine Empire is just a shadow of its former self. It's really just a small kingdom. Um, and it only lasts 200 years after that, and then the Muslims conquer it. So, England under Norman rule, let's look at England a little bit. 12th century kings in Europe were very powerful. One of the reasons their power came from military might. Like, look at the King of France. The King of France didn't rule by military might, he ruled by Christian authority, religious authority, and economic power. In other words, money and God. Well, the kings in England, who had to constantly contend with the Danes, which were the Vikings, they had to constantly contend with Viking warriors and Viking invasions from the northern Europe and from Eastern Europe, Scandinavia. They really ruled with an iron fist. It was about military might. It wasn't about economic power, and even though the England was Christian, it was nominally Christian. It did not have anywhere there was nowhere near the influence in England of the Catholic Church as it was in, say, France. The Catholic Church was everywhere in France. Every single town, every community, every neighborhood had a Catholic church. It was you couldn't do anything in France without running face to face with the Catholic Church. England, while it was religious and I guess nominally Catholic, eh, religion took second seat to lots of other things in England. In 1066, three men contended for the throne of England. You had three people fighting for the throne of England: Harold of Wessex, Harold of Norway. Harold of Norway would have been a Viking, and William of Normandy also had been a Viking. Normandy was actually settled by Vikings. So these are both men who are descended from Vikings. They're warriors. And Harold of Wessex in England had learned to be a warrior, being the fact that he was surrounded by Viking warriors. So these are all warrior kings. These are men that rule by the sword. You either do what they say or they cut your head off. It's just that simple. Military might. Harold of Wessex eventually becomes king, but then the other two, the other Harold and William, prepare their armies to kill and take over Harold. So we end up with a three-way war here, all to control and rule England. William receives permission from the Pope. William actually gets permission from the Pope. Again, Normandy is nominally part of France, so therefore the Pope is highly tied into France. So Normandy actually asks the Pope for the permission from the Church to invade England, and the Pope readily agrees, because the Pope has very limited authority over England, very limited power over England, as I just discussed. So the Pope wants to use William as a instrument to gain authority and dominance over England, Christian authority over England, Catholic authority. Even though again they're Catholic, they didn't really they were far less Catholic than most other parts of Europe. So this was a way for the church to work with France, as it had done many times over the last 300 or 400 years, just another partnership between part of France and the Catholic Church to dominate someone else. So he gets permission to attack. King Harold defeats Harold of Norway. So Harold of Wessex ends up killing and defeating Harold of Norway, which opens the door to William of Normandy to take on Harold face to face. William and Harold meets at the Battle of Hastings. Battle of Hastings in 1066. Harold is defeated and killed, and William becomes the King of England. There you go. Complicated. It really is. It really is Game of Thrones without the dragons. It really is. Oh, and the undead too, I guess. But it's exactly what it is. kings killing kings and lords killing lords and treachery and backstabbing and double dealing and espionage and assassinations. Trust me, I mean, I have no idea who George R. R. Martin's inspiration was for his Game of Thrones stories, but very well could have been England, and all the stuff that happened here in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in England, because it was totally Game of Thrones, without dragons and undead zombies and shit. Really brutal stuff. Slaughtering of entire families. Like they would kill entire royal families. Why do you have to kill them all? Because royalty is passed down through bloodlines. Therefore, if you want to take over a kingdom and you want to have a coup and you want to take the king out, you can't just stop there. You got to kill the king, his sons, his cousins, his family, his nieces, and nephews. Literally, you might have to wipe out an entire family line of dozens or hundreds of people. You got to kill them all, because any one of them, if they have a blood connection to who had been king, could therefore sometime in the future claim that they are the rightful king, and or their kids in generations hence. So you got to wipe out the whole damn family. Red Wedding, anybody? For those of you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, very interesting. As a result of his conquest, over 20% of all English died in this war. That's right. 20% of the entire English population died in these wars between Harold and William Normandy. Really? So you care about your kingdom, you care about your people, you're trying to all these folks didn't give two shits about common people. This was about power. Power and glory, prestige. However many people had to die, didn't matter. That's all that mattered. It is peace through death. How do we achieve peace? Wipe out all of our enemies, literally kill them all. Then we'll have peace. That's exactly what it is. Also, that is a storyline that goes through Game of Thrones. Sorry, I don't know why I'm going through. I just watched the Game of Thrones last season, so I'm sort of thinking about it. How this all sort of ties into and relates to it. It really is. Only that's fiction. This is real, and hundreds of thousands were killed, millions even killed by this. The between soldiers, starvation, entire cities burned. It was bad. Probably the worst war in England's history. This whole war between the heralds here. Probably the worst war in English history until World War One and World War Two in the 1900s. Brutal. So they beat everyone into submission and eventually take over the country. William divides all the lands between his own lords and barons, because remember, William is French. French Viking, French. He divides all of England between his own lands. He then actually stays in Europe. He stays in France, but is ruling England because he considers England so backward. He considers England people to be barbarians. He considers, and a lot of them are still pagans, frankly. A lot of them don't even necessarily ascribe to Christian theology. He considers them all to be pagans and barbarians. They're so behind. Well, the most cultured place in Europe was probably France. And so he wants to stay in France where there's culture and there's high society and there's intelligence and schools and education. And he doesn't want to live basically out in, the country, out among the barbarians of England. In 1086, William orders a survey of England, known as Domesday. He orders this survey of England, a census and survey. It's the most extensive survey of land, livestock, and territory that had ever been completed in Europe. It details everything of value. Every piece of land, every owner, literally every cow, every well, every place that there's any resources, every mine, everything. It takes years to do. And he does it so he can know exactly what he has and how much power and wealth and status he has. And in essence, he wants to use England as a almost like a bank, only a bank to be withdrawn from, not to make deposits. He wants to know exactly what England has so he knows how much he can suck out of it. He doesn't take over England to really rule England. He takes over England to use it as a repository of resources for France, really, or for Normandy, really. It's quite interesting. This is what we call the Norman Conquest, the Norman Conquest of England. Yeah. Remember, these are French. These are French people that have basically conquered and taken over England. And they are, we're not going to say they are enslaving the English, but practically. The English would call it slavery. Basically formed European institutions and hierarchy in England where it had not existed before. It ties England to the languages, politics, institutions, and culture of the continent. And the Norman conquest brings England into the culture of Europe. It makes England, for the first time, really part of Europe. Why had it been so different? Because it's not really part of Europe. It's an island off the coast. So it had really been separate from Europe always. It had always run its own course. Its religion had been different. Its entire governmental system had been different. England had always gone its own path. But now that England was being ruled by European lords and kings for years, it basically creates a European style society in England. Culture, language, art, architecture starts really mirroring everything from France and Northern Europe. It does bring civilization to England, which really hadn't existed. England starts building up cities and towns and starts building up larger communities. And in many places, England does really become European for the first time. There we have the region of Normandy, which is in France. We can see the Battle of Hastings here. Wessex, the King of Wessex. So you had Harold in England. Then you had let's look at him here. You had Harold of Wessex here in England. Then you had Harold of Norway, which actually Norway is way over here. Norway came in and invaded England. Eventually, he's defeated. And then you end up with Harold versus William, and William makes his invasion here at Hastings, ends up killing Harold of Wessex, and takes over England. Really in the name of France. Quite interesting. But it completely changes England. It remakes England into a whole new country. The Bayeux Tapestry. This is part of a 230-foot long cloth. That's right, 330 feet. That's the height of a 23-story building. I mean, that's just like, wow. It's a 230-foot long cloth. This is about the Norman invasion of England. It tells the story in pictures. Really, in imagery, it tells the story of the Norman invasion of England. English are on the right, on the foot, and the Normans are on the horses over here. The Normans are really knights on horseback in armor, while the English are less civilized. They're not using horses as much. Their armor is less. The Normans really had the advantage. They were better militarily trained. They were used to fighting large battles and wars. They had the horses. Yeah. Who really won this is, well, we know who won. But looking at the image, can you tell who's winning? Can you really tell who's going to win this battle from looking at the image? Furthermore, what are all these things up here on the top? What are all these symbols at the top? These are like animals, like mythological animals with different symbols. What are all those? The Norman knights here. What do you have here on the bottom? These are a bunch of archers on the bottom. I don't know. Also, look at the art here. Look at how sort of childish the art is compared to what we see in many places in Europe in this time period. Yeah, very interesting. And last thing we'll talk about is this. Okay, good. Here we go. The King of France. The King of France generally just governed the Ile de Paris. The Ile de Paris. Let's see if I have it on the map. I really don't have it listed. We saw it on a map before. It's called the Ile de Paris. That's really what he governed. But he also was a monarch. He was a king. Louis VII the Fat. That's what they called him. Louis the Sixth. Sorry, Louis VI the Fat, from 1107 to 1137. He was a tireless defender of royal power, believing royal power was absolute. He's an absolute monarch. Is what we actually call it, absolute monarch, meaning all power and decisions are in the hands of the king. Now, that's what hit. Now, France doesn't really become an absolute monarchy. France actually shares a lot of its power with the people. Although the people are really the elite upper class, but still there's shared power. He wants to be an absolute monarch there. An absolute monarch does everything, makes all the rules, makes all decisions, passes all the laws. Literally every single word out of his mouth is law. If he says kill those people, burn that city down, you go burn it down, you kill everybody. You do exactly what the king says. Absolute monarchy. He would pretend or play that he actually represented God. Um, he portrayed himself as a hero to the French lords, the French knights, the French defender of the church, defender of the poor. He often called upon his vassals to aid him anytime he needed assistance in fighting wars or going on crusades or collecting taxes, and he collected a lot of taxes. France and Paris became rich and wealthy under his ruling. He also drove revenues directly from Paris. He actually took a chunk of all the money coming. Paris was in essence like this commune society we talked about. They were almost an independent organization, the city of Paris, with a thriving economic center. He drew off a part of those profits. In essence, all the revenues Paris made, part of it had to go to the king, and made him rich. At one point, he was the richest king in Europe. Still probably paled in comparison to the Pope and the Catholic Church, but still quite wealthy. He could dispense favors, he could give gifts, he could build up his prestige and power, and eventually he creates the basis of the French monarchy, which is incredibly significant because it survives for, well, we have French kings for the next 800 years. So it creates a very strong basis for the French monarchy. Another thing which allows the French monarchy to survive is it ties itself to the Catholic Church in Rome, as it had already been doing for centuries. And so in other words, the better the church did, the better France did. The better France did, the better the church did. They were reciprocal isn't the right word. Symbiotic. It was a symbiotic relationship between the Catholic Church and France, the French kings. And then this is where we'll end it right here. This is the last thing we'll see here. This gives you an idea what it sort of looks like after everything. After just about everything happens, this is what you have. You have England, which is now ruled by Normandy, so it's the same color. You have France here, the royal domain. This is the Ile de Palais, although this is a little bigger than that, actually. You have Germany now. You have the German Kingdom or German Empire, which I think they actually call themselves the Holy Roman Empire here at this point. Uh, Biggest place in Europe, actually, the biggest empire. Well, other than the Rus, which the Rus are mostly, the Russians are mostly in Asia. Yeah, the Byzantine Empire, which still exists here. Germany's much bigger. You have the Seljuks. Over here, you have the Abbasids. You have the Fatimids. Down here, you have the Almoravids. You have this entirety of Spain, which is entirely controlled by the Muslims. You have multiple kingdoms. You have the Kingdom of Aragon, Castile, Leon, Portugal. Actually, in this point in time, yeah, at this point in time, they've already started retaking it. Northern Spain has already been retaken by European Christians. So the Muslims actually still only control half of Spain by this point. This is so they only control half of Spain. This is actually now Christians up here controlling northern. Aragon and Castile are kingdoms. Leon and Portugal are kingdoms. It's pretty fractured if you look at it. Look at each of these different colors, the different kingdom. No one really has dominance. The only dominance you see on here is Muslim, but it's not really Muslim dominance. Because just what you see on this map alone, there's 1, 2, 3, there's 5 different kingdoms. So even though they're all the same color, the map makers put them all the same color because they're Muslim, they're actually 5 separate kingdoms. So, yeah. And even though Russia looks so big up here, it's not really. Most of this is empty lands. Most of this is wide open lands, very sparsely populated. All right, well, that ends the chapter. It certainly took longer than I expected, but that's okay. More you know, better off you are. Thanks so much. We'll talk later.